Welcome, everybody. Welcome to a speech talk summary on this book, the Trans Anthology Project. Today, we're going to lecture through this book, the contents of this book, for the purpose, as Christians, of understanding the transgender phenomenon better. I think a lot of conservatives and Christians don't understand it and rely on conservative arguments and polemics as kind of their approach to dealing with transgenderism. But there's several problems with that. Number one, you don't actually understand what the trans person is experiencing. Even if you're correct about your arguments against them, most people don't experience life through arguments. They experience life through people. And so, as Christians, if we don't understand transgender people, then we're going to fail to give them the gift of Christian love. Kind of the purpose is asking the question, how do we love a trans person as Christians? And my approach to trying to do that has been to read experiences of trans people. So the reason why this book is really important is it's not an apologetic, primarily not an apologetic for transgenderism. It's primarily a source material of people going through this phenomenon that describe what it's like in poetic terms that come from the heart. And as Christians, if we can understand what's coming from the heart of a person going through these experiences, then we're more likely to be able to interact with them in a positive manner. Now, I'm not saying that means we're compromising, and it's actually totally the opposite. As I went through these experiences, I would say became more uncompromising. Let's begin going through this book. What I'm going to do is I'm going to basically summarize the book and provide the supporting quotations. And then we're going to talk about what I think is the most important story in the book. It's the story of a trans person, so-called, that is in communication with a kind of spirit. So that will be very interesting. I don't want to spoil the whole thing, but before we get there. And then there'll be more poems that kind of support my analysis of that story. There'll be an interesting little bonus section kind of at the end about what the book views religion as, which will also be important. If we're Christians trying to grant Christian love, we need to understand how a transgender person sees Christianity. Let's start with a quote from the book. In the introduction, the Trans Anthology Project was founded on the principle that while education can change minds, personal stories can change hearts. Stories have the power to touch people in a moment and leave a lasting impression. Through stories, we can step into the world of another and get a glimpse of what their life might be like. Stories can truly be transformative. Of course, we know that as Christians. That's what the biblical stories are all about, touching us and touching our hearts and changing us. However, the agenda in this book is to try to use these stories to convert us to their mindset. But we don't have to accept that. We can still grant that this book will be valuable for understanding the experience of transgender people without compromising on our Christian conscience and being cajoled and coerced into their viewpoint. Let's jump into chapter 1, which is terms and definitions. Chapter 1 is going to give us the lens that the book wants us to see the poems and narratives and stories through. So we'll briefly go over this lens, which is a view about gender and biology and sexual orientation. We'll critique it from a logical perspective, but then we'll jump into the stories and we'll get right to the heart of the matter. So the first thing is that all these terms and definitions that they're going to give us are under the presupposition of progressivism. They are subject to flux and change and therefore must be outdated. They will eventually be outdated, or they accept it is already outdated. So it's important to understand that from their viewpoint, these are not stable truths. But regardless, they're going to try anyways to define them. Okay, so the first point is they are describing what gender is. Gender is pertaining to the self, the mind, or the soul. And basically what it is an internal felt experience. That's gender. Now we go to sex. It explains sex isn't essential, but rather assigned. Sex isn't objective, but assigned. It's assigned by a doctor at birth. So they have assigned female at birth or they have assigned male at birth. So they don't believe that it's an objective fact that you're male or female. They believe that it's arbitrarily assigned. That's sex. Sexual orientation is innate, stable. You're born with your sexual orientation. Your sexual orientation is who you're attracted to. That relates to the gay and lesbian viewpoint. So the Lady Gaga song, right? Everybody knows, "Baby, I was born this way," right? So that's what they're affirming. They're affirming that even though sex is assigned, male or female, your attraction is innate. That's important because they don't want you to ever think that someone could be converted from their sexual orientation if they're gay or lesbian. That's sexual orientation. Transgender is defined as an inconsistency between gender and sex. So my internal, innate, felt sense of my gender role and who I am, masculinity, femininity, sometimes non-masculinity, non-femininity, gender non-conforming, that contradicts my external body, my sex organs, my biological sex. Now you'll notice that we're equivocating now already on biological sex because earlier we said biological sex is assigned and not objective. But now transgenderism is a inconsistency between my biological sex characteristics and my internal gender, my external sex and my internal gender. So which is it? Is it assigned? In which case transgenderism is just an assigned inconsistency between my assigned sex and my internally felt subjective gender? Or is it really objective? We'll find as we go through their definitions that they equivocate on the meaning of gender and the meaning of sex. We'll get to that later, though. Queer is when all these definitions that we just went over, none of it applies. So queer is just magically being outside of any of these categories. Coming out is defined in the book as trying to integrate your external sex with your internal gender. Or your external role, like your pronouns, your names, with your internal gender. Well, sorry, that's transitioning. Okay, let me back up. Transitioning is trying to integrate external with internal. External role or external biology with internal gender. But but coming out is just telling people that you have a different gender, which is kind of a process of integrating your social role, if you tell people. Okay, chapter 2, we're going to go back. We're going to back up, and the book's going to talk about gender again. What is this internal sense that the trans person experiences? A quote from the book in chapter 2. While biological sex refers to biological and anatomical body parts, notice the contradiction. Before it referred to assigned female or assigned male at birth. Gender is a core component of our inner sense of self, our inner mind, our inner self, our inner perception. Though we are born with an ineffable sense of ourself, including gender identity, our gender expression is greatly influenced by the culture in which we live, our families of origin, and our lived experiences. So, it's saying that culture can produce a different expression. We're impressed by culture, stamped by culture to express our gender in a certain way. But our inner self is incommunicable, ineffable, and diverse. And this outside culture, external, you'll see this internal-external dichotomy constantly. External culture, arbitrary. Internal self, truth. It goes on to talk about puberty and says that puberty, being external, may not conform with one's gender. Then it talks about gender dysphoria being a mismatch between gender and body, internal and external. There can be two kinds of dysphoria, bodily dysphoria and social dysphoria. Bodily dysphoria is relating to our body. Our body doesn't match my gender. External body doesn't match internal sense of self. Social dysphoria, though, is a mismatch between expected roles, like, say, sports, right? Sports have masculine and feminine roles. At least they used to, right? Before all this happened, they used to be gendered. But also my name. You know, people, Caleb is a pretty, generally speaking, Caleb is a male-sounding name, a manly name. Christina, female-sounding name, right? So if there's a mismatch in my feminine name with my internal masculine identity, that's social dysphoria. But also pronouns, right? He, her pronouns can mismatch my internal sense of self. That is social dysphoria. That's bodily dysphoria and social dysphoria, two kinds of dysphoria. Talks about how one explores or discovers their gender, which presupposes that it's innate and stable, right? When you explore or discover something, it's already there in the way that it is before you have explored it or seen it. Means that gender is innate, or they're trying to say gender is innate. If they say gender is discovered, then gender is innate. Non-binary is when your gender is outside male and female binaries. So before we were talking about roles, masculinity and femininity, they claim that gender can go beyond either of those. So gender is starting to take on, you'll notice, as a Christian, you'll notice gender is taking on transcendent categories. Ineffability, diversity, transcendence, transcending male-female separation, male-female division. That's transcendence. It can be masculine or feminine or beyond both, or neither. That's a transcendent way of talking. Overview of a couple stories. There's one story about a rebel feminist who kind of gets interested in and engaged in going outside of gender norms. She has a kid, however, and this kid she raises to where this kid's room is completely gender neutral in her eyes. Toys are gender neutral. Clothes gender neutral. And the kid ends up growing up and coming out as trans. And there's a section where the feminist is actually disappointed because the kid is starting to get obsessed with her appearance and in such a way that almost the feminist was trying to avoid her whole life, to avoid stereotypes, masculine and feminine stereotypes. But now she's kind of disappointed or worried about her kid because her kid, as a trans person, is now obsessed with those very stereotypes. It's very interesting. There's another story where a different side of gender is explored. Not gender being discovered and innate, but now gender being fluid, transient, swappable. Kind of like a widget or kind of like a piece of clothing, right? I could swap this red shirt for a blue shirt tomorrow. And so I like to call this view of gender the clothing of the soul definition of gender. So there's the gender that's innate and explorable and stable. And then there's another definition of gender that is in the book, which is the clothing of the soul, which is swappable, interchangeable, and transient. So there's another contradiction with how gender is defined in the book. Okay, now we're getting to the meat of this book, which is a story that I'm going to read to you because in the story, I believe the deepest spiritual sense of what transgenderism truly is conveyed. And what is transgenderism? What is it really? We're going to find out as we read this story. And it's not going to be scientific like we've been told, right? It's not going to be what we have been told it is. It's not going to be psychological, but it's actually going to be spiritual, ontological. This story is titled Two Crescent Moons. And I'm going to read the full thing. 1. He was named out of necessity. The atoms colliding in my new and volatile universe were too fast and too hot. Ray, that's the name of this he, condensed from these overwhelming desires and was born my North Star. Young and bright, I couldn't look away, let alone forget his shine. I see Polaris gleam when he's in the mirror, and total darkness when I've forsaken us both. So this person, it's a she sees Ray in the mirror. That's an important detail. 2. Ray is like my twin, yet behaves like a younger brother. Maybe there was a time when we were one being, before the Big Bang. But then we were torn apart, thrust into different worlds, like two moons always orbiting out of phase with one another. Now, was that description psychological or was that ontological? He's the version of myself that I see in fleeting moments in the mirror. Sometimes he's so close that I can feel what he feels. Sometimes he's so far away that no matter how long I look at my reflection, I only see me. So it's almost like, is Ray part of this person or is Ray separate from this person? He's living his best life and I'm stuck on this side, unable to join. I'm jealous of him, so jealous that I turn angry, gritting my teeth as I wipe away my tears. He doesn't know what he did wrong. His face suggests panic. His face. Right? That's a personal encounter with Ray, whoever this Ray is. For all I know, he wants to be me too. We lie in the fetal position, face to face, becoming two crescent moons. That fetal position. The fetal position, if you're in the fetal position, you're paralyzed and scared. I would argue anyway. Why would you, if you've ever had a panic attack, right? If you've ever experienced paranoia or a panic attack, you'll often go into the fetal position. Why would you ever want to be me? There's nothing left for you, I cry, but all he does is stare. 3. Ray comes to me in the bus window. He materializes the moment I realize that no one in the bus understands the feeling of being the only person who can comfort you through your own reflection. There we go. We see kind of a merging of pronouns there. I am the only person who can comfort you through your own reflection. So Ray's separation is ambiguous in that paragraph because the pronoun is predicating both the person and Ray as the same identity grammatically. He stares back at me. He's taking the same bus too, just in his parallel world. So, parallel world is something spiritual, otherworldly, ontological, I would say, not psychological. I tell him with my older sister tone, we're the only two people who can understand. No one would ever be able to come as close as you and I. He nods and fades away as the bus drives away. 4. Summer afternoon. I've woken up late again. My body feels terrible. Too restless to stay in bed, but too tired to get up. I roll to my side and pretend Ray is there, forming our crescent moons. So back to the fetal position. He's as tired as I am. Would you come here and rot with me together into one corpse, lying in the forest, and wait for the fungi to take us? Yes, he says. He smiles and I smile too. This Ray communicates to this person in the fetal position when this person is feeling terrible by their own admission and asks a suicidal question to Ray, and Ray likes that. Ray's smiling, right? Ray wants this person to rot, to be one corpse, quote, unquote, and for the fungi to take us, quote, unquote. So Ray wants this person united with it in death. So I can't think of any more Christian a description of a demon. 5. In my dreams, Ray has an undercut. In my waking hours, I touch where hair meets nape and wish my long hair would magically trim itself. So now this person's wanting to be similar, to mimic Ray. I know it's inevitable that he'll come into my world more often, and I won't be able to ignore it. He's as stubborn as me, after all. Is there a way for you to grow without burying me? Is there a way for me to live without killing you? So, now the person's asking, if Ray comes into my world, am I going to still exist? And if Ray doesn't, is Ray going to still exist? So there's competition between their existences. It's either one or the other. Christian love is the opposite, right? Because we cooperate with God's grace. There's no competition between my existence and God's existence. I don't get swallowed up by God's infinity. But I still stay Caleb. I still stay distinct in my identity, even if I unite with God. It's the opposite, though, with this Ray. It's the opposite. I search for him through the rain-covered window. So now we've seen 4 references to mirrors. 2 references at the beginning to mirrors. Seeing Ray in the reflection of the bus window. And now seeing Ray in the rain-covered window. He sits in his favorite sunflower dress. Eyes watery, ever so patiently waiting for me to answer. Ray is a cross-dresser. There. 6. Ray is the moon, the stars. He's my nourishment, my poison, my joy, and my sadness. So, the moon and the stars are heavenly references, And nourishment and poison are sacramental references. References to taking in bodily, right? Joy and sadness. So Ray is an angelic heavenly being that you can be nourished, that you take into yourself. So Ray is a possessor of your body, you could say, or Ray enters your body, you could say. But I'm still hoping for the day someone calls his name and I can turn and say, yes, that's me. So now two previous times we saw the pronoun. 3 times. Actually, multiple times there's references to, am I separate from Ray? Or is Ray me? Am I Ray? You know? And now at the very end of this poem, we see, I'm hoping that when someone calls the name Ray, I turn around. So now Ray has taken over this person's identity. That's demonic possession. That is a story of demonic possession. That's how I read it anyway. Now let's go over where all of this leads, all of the results and fruits of the transgender experience. There's a chapter on the history and biology of gender. Basically, it teaches that the diversity of gender is against all ethics, shoulds and should nots. It's fate. So it's natural, it's fate. In the religion section, they'll even say that God created transgenderism. They say diversity is the most beautiful. So diversity over and against uniformity. Diversity, unique, different. You know, you think of artists and creatives, they're kind of wacky people, right? They're different. But then there's kind of like kind of regular average Joe people. They're a little bit more normal. So they're against normalcy. Their diversity is against the normalcy. Society is the problem. Society, culture, expectations, everything external, that's the problem against everything internal. Love is to embrace without boundaries. So as Christians, we're going to totally disagree with that. And that's ultimately how we have to love a trans person, is we have to love a trans person using boundaries. So I don't believe in using their pronouns or their names. Maybe I would use their name in a limited scenario where I don't know their original name. But if I use their name that is given to them by something like Ray, then I'm denying that person's God-given existence, God-given identity, the identity that their parents gave them, which is a gift, you know? So to me, the name and the pronoun are very important, and it's important that we set a boundary there. Now, I could be wrong. I don't know. But that's my view. My view is that the boundary is the way that we love a transgender person. Gender is a social construct. I mean, right? That's like the buzz. That's like such a buzz phrase. The history is they always go over natives and other cultures. So Hindu culture has hijras and Aboriginal Native Americans have two-spirit. And so they're claiming that this third gender historically vindicates transgenderism, and that it was patriarchy and Christianity that forced the gender binary of male and female. They're against Christianity here. They're against Christianity. They like to say XX and XY don't determine male or female, which is kind of true. So a quick nuance here. If you look into the biology, it is true that XX and XY don't perfectly make someone male or female. That a body can kind of switch pathways and end up being female or male. It doesn't deny the existence of true maleness or true femaleness, But it does seem like some people fall short of, their bodies sort of fall short of fully manifesting one identity or the other perfectly. But my belief is that God had an intention. That maybe the fall obscures, and I'm following Dr. David Bradshaw, his paper on Christian biological ethics called What Does It Mean to Be Contrary to Nature? Dr. David Bradshaw, that paper is really good, by the way, but Dr. David Bradshaw is a philosopher in Orthodox Christianity, and he says that sometimes the fall might obscure the maleness or femaleness of the identity, but there was still, even though we see, obscurely what it was intended to be, there was an intention to be male or female. Withholding love is telling them not to be authentic. So again, love us without boundaries. There's a bunch of poems called Just Embrace. So embrace without boundaries. That's what they want Christianity love to be about. Names are important. Dead naming is offensive. The future is better than the past. So your name given by your parents is this past dead thing. And since it doesn't match my internal gender, we have to swap it out. There's a lot about the future. Chapter 6 is about the future. So it's a progressive narrative that they're living through. That's anti-Christianity. That is anti-truth. And in Father Seraphim Rose's book on nihilism, he talks about that exact progressive presupposition as being a product of nihilism. It makes an apologetic for hormone blockers, cross-sex hormones, and gender-affirming surgery, which you can learn all about that elsewhere. The book acknowledges that there's a connection between autism and transgenderism. There's a story in the book that was kind of interesting of a parent describing her experience of a transgender person. And one of the details and admissions from that book is that the mental health of the trans kid gets progressively worse, even though they keep doing more and more for this trans person. So the parent describing her son or daughter, I think it's originally a daughter. Over the course of the next year, our daughter, I'm just going to change it, our daughter struggled to attend school due to debilitating dysphoria and anxiety. That's after they're starting to try to help the daughter. And then here on page 222, we have this quote. Along the way, we had small successes, such as finding a parent education and support program and enrolling our daughter in a virtual therapy group with other trans teens. However, the school struggles and mental health challenges continued to mount. So it's not getting better. At the time of this writing, we have a solid team of professionals in place, and even with this solid team of experts, we continue to struggle as a family with the burden of trying to prioritize the various needs: physical, social, academic, and mental health. They kind of try to pass this off as just part of the process, but I find it interesting that they're honest enough to admit that it's actually not helping. The section on religion is worth quickly noting. All major world religions worship a supreme being who is called by many different names, but is believed to be the creator of all. With this in mind, it's interesting to consider that what creation suggests about gender diversity. When we begin to look, we find dozens of examples of gender diversity in nature. In fact, according to a November 14th, 2022 piece by Laura Camon in El País, nearly 5% of animals have the ability to change their sex. So we see kind of universalism, Platonism, ecumenism. Now, is that scientific or is that metaphysical? It's metaphysical. But it's all the same generic deity, right? There's no one truth, one church, one God as Father, Son, and Spirit. But all the religions believe in a creator that would probably accept gender diversity, right? No. Regardless of your specific religion or faith, here's another quote from the book, consider setting aside the concern that gender diversity is wrong in the eyes of the Creator because we have plenty of evidence to the contrary. So just stop, don't fully accept your religion. If your religion teaches something else, set that aside out of concern for gender diversity. We're almost done. Chapter 8 is titled Future. As described earlier, 100 years ago, a shift in paradigm occurred when it was ultimately determined that left-handedness was not a sign of the devil. The current increase in these coming out as trans and non-binary is similar to the rapid increase in left-handedness we saw in the 1920s or 1940s. During that time, acceptance grew for individuals to use their left hand when that was more natural for them. They used that left-handedness as a springboard to talk about the gay and lesbian revolutions, which also were spurred on by the feminist revolution. And if we remember the story at the beginning, there's a story of a feminist and her son, I believe, becoming trans because of the feminist attitude. So feminism actually produces, not only in individuals' lives, it produces transgenderism, but historically, it's the source of gay and lesbian and transgenderism. And I would cite Rachel Wilson's great book. It's called Occult Feminism as my kind of source for that. I'd recommend reading that book. So progress, and revolution. Progress and revolution. That is the narrative of history. The world is round and heliocentrism as a progress narrative. So we used to believe the world was flat. We used to believe that geocentrism was true. But now we know that those things are not true. And likewise, we used to believe in gender norms in male-female dichotomy. But now we know, right, that transgenderism is true. So transgenderism will be accepted like the above revolutions and examples through history. Chapter 9 has some interesting statistics. 12 to 15-year-old is the average age of someone to realize their gender. Pretty young, right? Most people tell about their realization or come out within 6 months of realizing. 97% do it socially, they come out. 36% do it medically using hormone blockers and cross-sex hormones. And 28% do it legally by changing their legal name and their legal status. 3% do an actual bottom surgery, so a penis construction or vagina construction. 9% do a top surgery, where it's either breast removal or it's breast enhancement. 48% do none of those medical operations, and 43% do hormone therapy. 28% do hormone blockers. We saw with the story of Ray that it's a form of spiritual delusion, and we also saw metaphysics, ontology, which is in the domain of philosophy and religion, not the domain of science. So anybody who tries to tell you that transgenderism is science-based, they're wrong. And from their own reading list, from their own book, their own apologia is the source of how we know that they're wrong. Transgenderism is spiritual delusion. So Ray is the person, the she, is communicating with a demon and eventually gets possessed by a demon. We also saw that the ideology and the lens that trans people use, gender ideology, is a big mess of logical contradictions. So they equivocate on their definition of sex, either being assigned at birth or being biological. Assigned at birth entails a mind-dependent subjective judgment, whereas biology entails a human mind-independent objective distinction. We also saw with their definition of gender, that gender is sometimes, for some people, flux. It's like clothing for the soul. You can just swap it out the next day for a new pair of clothing. Or sometimes it's discovered and explored and innate, which presupposes that it's stable. So yeah, gender ideology is logically incoherent. We saw that transgenderism comes from feminism, and it's a rejection of culture, a rejection of patriarchy. So it shares that with feminism, and it shares the progressive narrative of history with feminism. And ultimately, we see in this book that experience confesses while ideology obscures. So the experiences, like the narratives and the personal stories written by the trans people themselves, are very insightful in helping us understand the phenomenon. But the ideology surrounding it is very unhelpful. It obscures and tries to basically get us to not understand what's really happening, to get us to not see that it's a form of spiritual delusion, and convince us that it's either that it's innate, that it's natural, that God wants it. Whatever apologia they want, they try to obscure it with these ideologies they're logically incoherent. So ultimately, we see and hopefully this gives us as Christians trying to love a trans person a better idea of how to love them, how to understand their experience. And ultimately, that love is going to be, in my view, it's going to be the use of Christian boundary setting. And we're going to set boundaries. And we may, in my experience, there's a transgender person that I work with at work. I've never used the pronoun that she wants me to use, nor the name that she wants me to use. I've just found ways around kind of doing that. I believe that boundary communicates that I see her as a her, that I prefer her name that was given by her parents, her culture as a gift, over the name that she accepts from whatever source that she got that name from. And that is my boundary, and I will pray for her. I will interact with her professionally at work, but I am not going to capitulate. I am not going to let her coerce me as a Christian and coerce my Christian conscience into accepting her narrative about who she thinks she is and about who the spirits and the demons are telling her that she is. So that's my view. Those are my thoughts. That's the summary of the Transgender Anthology Project, written by Chrissy, Boylan, and Heather H. Kirby. Now, I'm sure those names are not their original names, but since I don't know their original names, I guess I just have to use them. So, there you go. Hope you found that insightful.